The sun in the Arizona Territory was merciless, hanging high in the sky like a fiery overseer. Every blade of grass seemed brittle. Every fence post leaned like it, too, was tired of holding its ground. On the edge of this harsh land stood a struggling ranch owned by a man named Thomas Avery. Once, this place had the promise of prosperity, but now, dust choked the soil and the cattle grew thin. Thomas had inherited the ranch from his father, a man of iron will who believed hard work could conquer any hardship. But Thomas knew better. Sometimes fate stacked the deck against you no matter how much sweat you spilled. With each passing season, his debts to the local bank grew heavier, and whispers in town suggested he might soon lose the only thing he had left of his family's legacy. He was not a man who sought pity. Thomas was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with quiet resolve. Yet anyone who looked close enough could see the strain etched on his face. His hands were calloused and scarred, his clothes worn thin, and his eyes always scanning the horizon, as though searching for a break in the unrelenting misfortune that shadowed him. Each morning, Thomas rose before dawn, saddled his weary horse, and rode the range to check on his cattle. The land stretched wide and empty, broken only by rocky cliffs, mesquite trees, and the winding river that cut through the valley. That river was both a blessing and a curse. It offered water for his animals, but its moods were dangerous. When rains swelled in the mountains, it could transform overnight into a raging beast. More than one traveler had been swept away by its currents. Despite his burdens, Thomas clung stubbornly to the ranch. He had no wife, no children, and little reason to stay except pride, and perhaps a quiet hope that someday things might turn. He believed that if he let go, if he sold off what little he had, he'd be surrendering not just his father's memory, but also his own identity. He wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Still, the loneliness weighed on him. Nights were the worst, when the wind rattled the shutters and coyotes howled across the open desert. He often sat by the dim light of a lantern, staring at old photographs, wondering if he was cursed to spend his life fighting a losing battle. The townsfolk respected him, but kept their distance. Some admired his grit, others quietly mocked his misfortune. And then there were those who whispered that the land itself had been taken long ago from the Apache, and perhaps the ranch's failures were nothing more than justice catching up with him. Thomas didn't entertain such talk, but the words sometimes clung to his thoughts in the darkest hours. One particular evening, after another exhausting day of chasing strays and repairing broken fences, Thomas stood by the river. The sky burned orange and red as the sun sank, painting the water in molten colors. He watched the current swirl, powerful and restless, and thought about how easily it could sweep away all his troubles if he let it. He felt small before its strength, reminded that nature played by rules beyond human control. Yet little did Thomas know, that same river, the one that mirrored his struggles, was about to bring him face to face with a test that would change the course of his life forever. He was no hero, at least not in his own eyes. But fate has a way of finding ordinary men and pushing them into extraordinary moments. And before long, the struggling rancher would be forced to make a choice that would bridge two worlds, his own and that of the Apache people. The night after Thomas stood by the river, the skies broke open. Storm clouds rolled down from the mountains like dark cavalry, bringing with them a torrent of rain. The desert, which only hours before had been cracked and parched, now soaked up the downpour greedily until the earth could take no more. Streams that were once dry gullies roared to life, feeding the great river that cut through the valley. Thomas was awake long before dawn. The thunder had rattled his windows through the night, and the rain's steady drumming on the roof refused to let him sleep. By morning, he saddled his horse and rode out to check on the herd, hoping the animals hadn't scattered. The ground was soft and treacherous, and every hoofbeat sent water splashing into the air. As he rode closer to the riverbank, Thomas could hear its angry voice. The river was no longer the steady, calm current he'd watched at sunset. It was swollen and wild, thrashing against its banks, carrying branches, stones, and whole uprooted trees in its rushing body. Muddy waves crashed against the shoreline, reaching farther and farther up as though trying to swallow the land itself. Thomas dismounted at a high bluff, tying his horse to a cedar tree. From there he could see the chaos below, the kind of chaos that made men humble. The river writhed like a living creature, defying anyone foolish enough to come near it. Yet amid the churning water, Thomas's sharp eyes caught something unusual. At first, it seemed no more than a log tumbling helplessly along. But then, as the rain eased for a moment, he saw it again, an arm. His chest tightened. Someone was in the river. For a few seconds, he stood frozen, watching the figure disappear beneath the foamy waves, then surface again with a desperate flail. Whoever it was, they were fighting a battle they could not win. Thomas knew the river well enough to understand. If he didn't act, that person would be gone within minutes. He scrambled down the slick embankment, mud clinging to his boots. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to remember that he had no one waiting for him if he died. But something deeper inside, perhaps the same stubborn pride that kept him tied to his ranch, pushed him forward. At the water's edge, Thomas tore off his coat and boots. The current looked merciless, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of hesitation. With one last glance at the struggling figure downstream, he leapt into the freezing torrent. The shock hit him like a hammer. The cold clutched his chest, stealing his breath, while the current pulled at him like invisible hands. He kicked hard, angling toward the person who was drifting farther away. Rain pelted his face and waves slapped against his head, but he fought onward. At last, his hand brushed against wet skin. The figure was enormous, far larger than he expected. A woman, nearly half a head taller than himself, even in her weakened state, with limbs as heavy as oak. She gasped for air, her dark hair plastered across her face, eyes wide with panic. "Hold on!" Thomas shouted, though the river swallowed his voice. He locked his arm around her chest, using every ounce of strength to keep both their heads above water. The current dragged them downstream like rag dolls, smashing them against floating debris and pulling them toward jagged rocks. Thomas's muscles screamed, his lungs burned, but he forced himself to keep going. He angled toward a bend in the river where the current was weaker. With each stroke, he felt the woman's weight threatening to pull him under, yet he refused to let go. Inch by inch, they crawled closer to the shallows. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas's feet scraped the riverbed. He staggered, half carrying, half dragging the woman to the muddy bank. They collapsed together on the shore, coughing and gasping, the storm raging above them. For a long while, neither spoke. Only the sound of their ragged breaths and the river's fury filled the air. But as Thomas turned his head, his eyes widened. This was no ordinary woman he had saved. She was towering, strong, and unmistakably Apache. And though he didn't know it yet, saving her would set into motion a chain of events that would transform his life in ways he could never have imagined. The storm eased at last, leaving behind a gray sky that dripped with mist. The river still churned angrily, but its wildest rage had begun to subside. On the muddy bank, Thomas Avery knelt beside the woman he had dragged from the water. His lungs still burned, his arms trembled, and every muscle in his body felt as though it had been torn apart. Yet he forced himself to focus on her. She lay sprawled on the ground, her chest rising and falling in heavy, uneven breaths. Water streamed from her long black hair, plastered against her sharp features. Her eyes were closed, but her body was unmistakably alive. Thomas pressed 2 fingers against her neck and found a strong, steady pulse. Relief washed over him, but as he studied her more closely, astonishment took hold. This was no frail victim. Even in her weakened state, she radiated strength. Her frame was massive, tall, broad-shouldered, with arms corded in muscle. Her soaked buckskin dress clung to her, revealing a figure that seemed built by the wilderness itself. She was a giant compared to most women Thomas had ever seen, nearly his equal in size and strength. She stirred, coughing water from her lungs. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, sharp, and piercing. When they locked on Thomas, he felt a shiver run through him. There was fire in those eyes, even in weakness. "You're safe now," Thomas said softly. Though he doubted she understood his words. His knowledge of the Apache language was limited to a handful of phrases, none of which seemed useful at this moment. The woman propped herself up on one elbow, still coughing. She looked around, then back at Thomas, her gaze wary, as if trying to decide whether he was friend or foe. Her hand instinctively reached for her waist, where a knife might have hung, but there was nothing there. The river had stripped her of her weapons. Thomas raised his hands slowly, palms outward, a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said. "I pulled you from the river. That's all." For a tense moment, neither moved. The only sound was the river groaning in the background. Finally, she sank back against the ground, too weak to resist whatever fate awaited her. Thomas reached into his saddlebag, which had somehow stayed tied to his horse above, and pulled out a blanket. He draped it gently over her shoulders. "Rest," he muttered. "You're safe here." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. She was Apache. Her people had no reason to trust men like him. Relations between settlers and the Apache had always been uneasy, sometimes erupting into bloodshed. What would happen if her people discovered she had been in the company of a white rancher? Still, Thomas couldn't ignore what he had seen, a human life on the verge of being claimed by the river. He hadn't hesitated then, and he wouldn't turn his back now. Slowly, the woman turned her head toward him. She studied him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. Then, in a hoarse but steady voice, she spoke in her own tongue, words Thomas could not understand. Yet he caught the tone, cautious gratitude, laced with pride. She tried to rise, but her legs gave way beneath her. Thomas caught her, steadying her massive frame with effort. She was heavy, her weight nearly toppling him, but he braced himself and guided her toward a dry patch beneath the cedar trees. She allowed it, though her pride was clear in the way she kept her chin lifted, as if refusing to show weakness. As she settled, Thomas sat back on his heels, studying her once more. Never in his life had he seen a woman like her, towering, powerful, yet so close to death only moments ago. Who was she? A chief's daughter? A warrior in her own right? Questions churned in his mind, but none had answers yet. For now, he had only one certainty: their lives were suddenly entangled, and fate had placed him in the path of someone who would change everything. Little did Thomas know, this was not simply a rescue. It was the beginning of a story that would draw him into the heart of the Apache world, and into the presence of a father whose gratitude would prove unimaginable. The storm had passed, but the valley still wore its scars. The river ran high and muddy, swollen with the night's fury, and the air smelled of wet earth and cedar. Thomas sat beneath the dripping branches, his back against a tree, watching the woman he had saved. She was still wrapped in his blanket, her broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill. She hadn't spoken again since her first few hoarse words. Instead, she watched him carefully, her dark eyes tracking his every movement. It was a look Thomas knew well, the look of someone weighing whether to trust or to fear. They were two strangers from worlds that rarely crossed except in conflict. Thomas, the poor rancher tied to a patch of land the desert seemed determined to claim, and she, a towering Apache woman whose people had lived free on these lands long before men like him had drawn borders on maps. Fate had pushed them together in the most unlikely of ways. He tried speaking to her again, his words slow and cautious. "Name? Do you have—" "Name?" He tapped his chest lightly. "Thomas." She tilted her head, studying him as if his language was a puzzle. Then, after a pause, she touched her own chest. "Nahava," Thomas nodded. "Nahava," he repeated, his voice careful, respectful. She gave the faintest nod in return, acknowledging that he had said it right. For the first time since pulling her from the river, he thought he saw a flicker of ease in her expression. Communication beyond that was difficult. His Apache was pitiful, hers English non-existent, but certain things didn't need words. When he offered her his canteen, she drank greedily, water running down her chin. When he tore a strip of cloth and bound a cut on her arm, she winced but allowed it, her pride softened by necessity. Still, the silence between them felt heavy. Thomas wondered what she thought of him, this white rancher with calloused hands and empty pockets. Did she see him as an enemy, an intruder on her people's land? or simply as the man who had dragged her from the river's grip. As the hours passed, Thomas's mind began to stir with unease. He had saved her life, yes, but what would come of it? If her people found her here with him, would they see his rescue as kindness or as abduction? The Apaches were fiercely protective of their own, and the presence of one of their women on his land could ignite a fire he wasn't ready to face. Yet, despite the risk, Thomas felt a pull he couldn't ignore. Something about her presence, her strength, her defiance even in weakness, sparked a respect in him he rarely felt for anyone. This wasn't a woman who needed saving in the usual sense. She was a warrior spirit who had been caught off guard by nature's fury. As the sun climbed higher, Nahava stirred, testing her strength. She stood towering over Thomas even in her weariness and scanned the horizon. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing the proud bearing of someone who belonged to the land itself. She said something sharp in Apache, pointing toward the mountains. Though Thomas couldn't grasp her words, he understood. She wanted to return to her people. He hesitated. If he helped her back, what reception would he face? Gratitude, suspicion, or hostility? And yet, how could he refuse? Leaving her to fend for herself in her weakened state would undo everything he had risked his life to accomplish. Thomas rose, brushing mud from his clothes, and gestured toward his horse. "I'll get you there," he said firmly, even if she didn't understand the words. The meaning, he hoped, was clear enough. Nahava regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a single nod. In that small gesture, a fragile bridge was built between them. A bridge of necessity, maybe, but also of something deeper. For Thomas, it was the first step into a world he had only glimpsed from a distance. For Nahava, it was a reluctant trust in a man she had every reason to fear. And together, walking side by side along the muddy path, they carried with them the weight of two worlds that had never truly met, until now. By the time Thomas guided Nahava into town, the storm had long since passed, but its presence lingered in the swollen river and muddy streets. The townsfolk, always alert to anything unusual, turned their heads as the pair rode in. Thomas sat stiff in his saddle, Nahava riding behind him. Wrapped in his blanket but still unmistakable in her size and bearing, whispers spread as fast as wildfire. "That's an Apache woman," one man muttered, tugging at his hat as they passed. "Looks like she's near 7 feet tall," another exclaimed. "What's Avery doing with her?" A group of women outside the mercantile clutched their baskets tighter, pulling children close. Their eyes followed Nahava, some filled with fear, others with a flicker of awe. For them, this wasn't just gossip. It was scandal. A white rancher riding into town with an Apache woman? Folks would talk about it for weeks. Thomas felt the weight of every stare. He hadn't planned on bringing her through town, but she needed food and rest before he attempted the long ride to her people's territory. He guided the horse straight to the blacksmith's stable, dismounted, and helped Nahava down. She was still weak, leaning on him for balance, but she held her chin high, meeting the townsfolk's gawking eyes without flinching. Inside the general store, the whispers grew louder. Old Mrs. Henderson froze behind the counter, staring at Nahava as if she'd walked out of one of the wild stories told by traveling men. "Morning?" Thomas said curtly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Need bread, jerky, and bandages." Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she filled his order. Her eyes never left Nahava, who stood silently at the door, towering over the shelves and ducking slightly beneath the wooden frame. As Thomas paid, he overheard two men talking near the back. "Mark my words, Avery's in over his head," one whispered. "You don't just take an Apache woman onto your land without consequence. Her people'll come for her. And for him." "Maybe he's trying to make peace," the other replied. "Or maybe he's just lost his mind." Thomas ignored them, though the words stung with truth. He didn't know what would come of this. All he knew was that he couldn't abandon the woman who now leaned against the doorframe, still alive because of him. As they stepped back onto the street, Sheriff Dalton approached, his hat low and his expression cautious. He was a fair man, but firm, and his job was to keep peace in a town that balanced on the edge of lawlessness. "Morning, Avery," Dalton said, his eyes flicking toward Nahava. Heard you pulled someone from the river last night. Thomas nodded. That's right. Didn't expect it to be. Dalton paused, choosing his words carefully. Her. She would have drowned, Thomas said evenly. I wasn't about to let that happen. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. You know what this means, don't you? Her people will come looking. Could be they see this as a rescue, or could be they see it as you taking one of their own. I'll face whatever comes, Thomas replied, though a chill ran down his spine at the thought. Dalton tipped his hat. Just be careful, Avery. The town's uneasy enough without trouble from the Apache. By the time Thomas mounted his horse again, the whispers had turned into full-blown rumors. Some said he was a hero, others claimed he was a fool asking for war. But whatever they thought, one thing was certain. The story of Thomas Avery and the giant Apache woman was now out in the open, and there would be no turning back. As he rode out of town with Nahava clinging silently behind him, Thomas knew the balance of his life had shifted. He was no longer just a struggling rancher. He was a man caught between two worlds, and both were about to test him in ways he had never imagined. The ride back to Thomas's ranch was quiet. Nahava leaned against him, silent but watchful, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Though she had not spoken more than a few words since the rescue, her presence was heavy with meaning. Thomas could feel it in the way she sat, proud even in exhaustion, dignified even in need. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun had dipped low again, setting fire to the desert sky with streaks of red and gold. Thomas helped her inside, settling her in the small cabin that had once belonged to his father. She refused his bed, choosing instead to rest near the fireplace on a blanket spread across the floor. Even in weakness, she was a woman who needed no pity. The next morning dawned hot and clear. Thomas was tending to his cattle when he felt it first, the prickle at the back of his neck that told him he was being watched. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked toward the hills. There they were, a line of Apache warriors rode down the slope, their horses moving in silence, their figures sharp against the rising sun. Feathers fluttered from lances, rifles glinted in the light, and their dark eyes were fixed on him. At the head of the group rode a man unlike any Thomas had ever seen. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, but his posture was that of a king. His face bore the lines of both wisdom and hardship, his gaze steady and commanding. Draped across his shoulders was a robe adorned with beads and eagle feathers, and at his side hung a long knife carved with intricate designs. This was no ordinary warrior. Thomas knew instantly this was Nahava's father, the chief of her people. Thomas's hand instinctively went to the revolver at his hip. Then he stopped. Drawing his weapon would only end in death. So, with measured calm, he removed his hat and stood tall, waiting. The riders approached in silence until they surrounded him. Dust swirled in the air as horses stamped the ground. Nahava stepped out of the cabin then, leaning on the doorway, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The moment her eyes fell on the elder, a flicker of relief softened her expression. She spoke in her tongue, her voice firm but warm. The chief dismounted, striding forward with the grace of a man who commanded without effort. He studied Thomas, his gaze hard as flint. "You saved her?" he asked in rough English, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority. Thomas met his stare. "Yes, pulled her from the river yesterday. She'd have drowned." The chief's eyes narrowed. "Why?" The question struck Thomas like a hammer. Why indeed? He had no clever answer, no speech prepared. He simply shrugged. Because it was the right thing to do. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The Apache warriors shifted, their hands never far from their weapons. Thomas felt the tension pressing down, his heart pounding. Would they see him as a savior or as a thief? Then slowly, the chief turned toward Nahava. She spoke again, her words flowing like water. Though Thomas couldn't understand, he could hear the steadiness in her tone, the lack of fear. The chief listened, his stern features softening just slightly. At last he turned back to Thomas. His eyes still held their weight, but there was something new in them, a glimmer of respect. "You risked your life for her," the chief said. "For my daughter. For that, you will not be forgotten." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief swept through him, but beneath it lingered a strange curiosity. What did the chief mean? Gratitude could take many forms, and he sensed that this man's way of repaying debts might be as vast and unexpected as the desert itself. The air was thick with uncertainty, but one thing was clear. The story was no longer just about Thomas and Nahava. Now her father had entered the stage, and whatever happened next would change everything. The air around Thomas felt heavy, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Surrounded by Apache warriors, with Nahava's father standing before him, he understood how thin the line was between life and death. A single command from the chief, and his ranch could be reduced to ashes before the sun set. The chief's eyes did not waver. They were dark, sharp, and unflinching, the kind of eyes that had seen battles, betrayals, and the shifting tides of power between his people and the settlers. Thomas stood tall, but his heart hammered against his ribs. "Tell me," the chief said in deliberate English, his voice like stone grinding against stone. "How did you find her?" Thomas glanced toward Nahava, who stood in the cabin doorway, wrapped in his blanket. Her gaze was steady, as if silently urging him to speak the truth. "I was out near the river after the storm," Thomas began. His voice was rough but steady. "Saw something in the water, thought it was a log. Then I saw her arm. She was drowning. I went in, pulled her out, brought her here." The chief's expression did not change. His warriors shifted restlessly in their saddles, their hands twitching near bows and rifles. One muttered something under his breath in Apache. "You risked your life," the chief said slowly, his tone neither soft nor kind. "Men do not risk their lives for enemies." Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't see an enemy," he replied. "I saw a person about to die." That was all. For a long silence, no one spoke. The only sounds were the restless snorts of the horses and the distant rush of the swollen river. Thomas's words hung in the air, fragile but defiant. Then Nahava stepped forward. Her tall figure was unshaken despite her lingering weakness. She spoke in her native tongue, her voice rising with quiet strength. Though Thomas could not understand the words, the way she gestured toward him, her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes burning with sincerity, made the meaning clear enough. She was defending him. The chief listened intently, his face unreadable. When she finished, he lifted his chin and looked at Thomas again. "My daughter says you fought the river itself to save her," the chief said, "that you gave her your strength when she had none left. This, I believe." Thomas exhaled, though the weight in his chest did not fully ease. He knew what came next would decide everything. Gratitude or vengeance, there was no middle ground here. The chief stepped closer until he stood only a few feet away. His presence was overwhelming, the kind of authority that came not from words, but from the way a man carried himself. He studied Thomas like one might study a wild horse, with respect, but also with caution. "You are a poor man," the chief said bluntly. "I see your land. I see your cattle. You struggle, yet you stand proud." His gaze sharpened. "You could have let the river take her. That would have been easy. But you did not. Why?" Thomas hesitated only for a heartbeat. "Because a man who walks away from a drowning woman isn't a man at all," he said. The words came out rough, but they were honest. And for the first time, Thomas thought he saw something flicker in the chief's stern expression. Not softness, but a recognition, as if he'd glimpsed a truth he could respect. The chief turned to his warriors. Speaking quickly in Apache, their tense stares loosened, though suspicion still lingered in their eyes. Finally, he faced Thomas again. "You will not be harmed," the chief declared. "You have done something rare. You have shown honor." Thomas felt the strength return to his legs, though his relief was tempered by uncertainty. The chief's words were not the end. They were the beginning of something larger. This was no small matter. Saving Nahava had tied him to her people, and whatever came next would ripple far beyond his ranch. And deep down, Thomas knew, the chief was a man who did not speak of debts lightly. Thomas stood rigid as the chief's words echoed in the still air. "You will not be harmed. You have shown honor." Relief washed through him, but it was only fleeting. The way the Apache chief studied him suggested this encounter was far from finished. The chief raised one hand, and at once his warriors dispersed, riding off toward the tree line. Thomas watched, wary. Within minutes, the sound of hooves rumbled back like thunder, and he saw dust rising in the distance. When the riders returned, they were not empty-handed. Behind them surged a herd of cattle, thick, strong beasts, more than Thomas had ever owned in his life. Their hooves pounded the earth as they were driven into his pasture, their hides gleaming under the sun. At the rear came a smaller group leading a line of horses. They were magnificent creatures, their coats sleek, their eyes sharp with intelligence. Thomas's breath caught. It was wealth beyond imagining. He could sell these animals and pay off every debt twice over. He could expand his land, secure his future, and live with dignity for the first time in years. The chief dismounted, his movements calm and deliberate. He stood tall before Thomas, the desert wind tugging at his long braids and the beads in his clothing. His presence carried an authority that went beyond mere leadership. It was the authority of a man whose word carried the weight of his people. "My daughter lives because of you," the chief said, his voice low but powerful. "You gave her back to me when the river tried to take her. For this you are owed." Thomas shook his head instinctively. "I didn't save her for reward," he said quickly, his voice hoarse. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." The chief's eyes narrowed, but not in anger. Instead, it seemed as though he was weighing Thomas's words, testing them against what he already believed. After a long pause, he gave a single nod. "That is why the gift is worthy," the chief replied. He gestured toward the herd. "Cattle, horses, more than enough to free you from the chains of debt, and more still to build a life worthy of a man of honor." Thomas staggered, his mind reeling. His small corral was nearly bursting already, filled with more life than it had ever held. He thought of the empty shelves in his cabin, the lean years when his stomach had growled through the night, the shame of begging bankers for more time. All of it seemed to vanish in an instant. "I don't know what to say," Thomas whispered, his throat tight. "Say nothing," the chief said firmly. "Live with honor. That will be enough." Nahava stepped forward then, her tall figure commanding even among the warriors. She looked at Thomas, then at her father. Her hand brushed briefly against her chest before she nodded. It was her way of saying thank you, though her eyes carried more weight than her words ever could. The chief turned back to his men and spoke sharply in Apache. The warriors began settling the herd into the ranch's pastures, ensuring the animals were secure. It was not a transaction, not a bargain. It was a declaration. Thomas understood then. This was no mere gift of animals. It was a bond. The Apache had extended their protection, tying his fate to theirs. No rustler would dare steal from him. No outlaw would cross him, not when the chief's shadow stood at his side. The rancher's life had changed in a single day, and it had nothing to do with gold or silver. He had saved a life and in return been given a future. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the land, Thomas realized the chief's words were not a closing, but a beginning. This gift was more than he could have dreamed, but it carried a weight of its own. For with wealth and protection came responsibility. And Thomas, though overwhelmed, knew one thing with certainty. He would carry it with the same honor that had brought him here. The days that followed were unlike anything Thomas Avery had ever known. The Apache camp settled near his ranch for a time, their fires glowing at night like scattered stars across the desert floor. For the first time, his land was alive with more than just the lowing of cattle and the moan of wind through the mesquite. Drums beat softly in the evenings, children laughed as they chased one another, and voices in the Apache tongue wove through the air like music Thomas could not understand, but felt deep in his bones. He should have felt uneasy. For years, he had heard tales of raids and bloody skirmishes between settlers and the Apache. But here, in the presence of Nahava's people, he saw something different. They were fierce, yes, but also disciplined, bound together by traditions far older than his ranch, older even than the borders drawn on maps. The unimaginable reward the chief had promised him still left Thomas humbled. Horses, strong and swift, grazed now in his corral. Cattle, fat, healthy, and more numerous than he'd ever dreamed, filled his pastures. His debts no longer haunted him. But even greater than these riches was the protection he had been granted. No outlaw or rustler in the territory would dare cross a man favored by the Apache chief. Yet amidst all this, it was Nahava who unsettled him most. She remained on his ranch during those days, recovering her strength. At first, their exchanges were clumsy, a patchwork of gestures, broken English, and the few Apache words Thomas knew. But slowly, a rhythm formed between them. One morning, she helped him repair a broken fence. Her strength was startling. She lifted heavy rails with ease, her movements confident and precise. When Thomas glanced at her, she caught his stare and raised an eyebrow, as if to remind him she was no fragile flower in need of saving. He smiled faintly, the first real smile he had worn in weeks. At night, by the fire, she sometimes told him stories in her language. He understood almost nothing, yet the way her voice rose and fell, the way her eyes glowed with memory, made him feel as though he did. She would gesture to the stars, to the mountains, to the river, weaving them into her tale. And though he could not follow every word, he knew the stories were old, older than him, older than his family's claim on the land. Bit by bit, the tension between them softened. What began as gratitude slowly became something more complex, respect. Thomas admired her resilience, her pride, and the unshakable way she carried herself. She, in turn, seemed to see beyond his worn clothes and calloused hands. He was no longer just the rancher who had saved her. He was a man who had faced the river and not faltered. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Nahava approached him. She looked down at him, for she was taller by more than a head, and placed a hand firmly on his shoulder. Her eyes held his, steady and unflinching. "You, brave," she said slowly, her English halting but clear. Then, after a pause, she added, "Not many like you." Thomas felt something shift in that moment. Not a romance, not yet, but a bond forged in struggle and survival. Something that stretched beyond language and culture. He nodded, his throat dry. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met," he said honestly. Though he wasn't sure she caught the words, but the look in her eyes told him she understood well enough. It was then Thomas realized that the greatest change brought by the chief's reward wasn't the cattle, or the horses, or the safety from debt. It was this, the unexpected bond he had found with Nahava. A bond born from a raging river, tested by suspicion, and strengthened in quiet moments between two people from different worlds. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both sensed that their paths were no longer separate. The weeks turned into months, and Thomas Avery's life no longer resembled the one he had lived before that fateful storm. The struggling rancher who once counted every coin, prayed for rain, and feared losing everything had been replaced by a man who now stood on ground firmly his own. His pastures were alive with new life. Strong cattle grazed in numbers that once seemed impossible, their lowing echoing across the valley. The horses the Apache had gifted him were not just beasts of burden. They were swift, proud animals, some of the finest in the territory. Buyers rode from distant towns to see them, and for the first time Thomas could negotiate from a position of strength. No banker's shadow lingered over his shoulder now, but prosperity was only part of the transformation. The true change ran deeper, woven into the very fabric of who Thomas was becoming. The Apache no longer regarded him as a mere outsider. Though he was not one of them, he was no longer treated as a stranger either. He was the man who had saved the chief's daughter, the man whose ranch was under the protection of their warriors. Travelers whispered of him, a rancher who lived between two worlds, trusted by both. Some envied him, others feared him, but all respected what he had earned. Yet it was Nahava who remained the most profound part of his new life. Their bond had deepened in ways Thomas had never expected. She still towered over him with her imposing strength, yet her presence had become a source of quiet comfort. She visited often, sometimes with her people, sometimes alone, and the two would walk the land together, speaking in broken words and gestures, learning one another's languages slowly. In those moments, Thomas realized that wealth and land were not the chief's greatest gift. It was the bridge he now stood upon, a bridge between his world and Nahava's, built from courage, trust, and respect. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky in gold and crimson, Thomas stood by the river, the same river that had nearly claimed Nahava's life and changed his forever. He remembered the fear, the cold, the weight of her in his arms as he fought the current. At the time, he had thought it a simple act of decency, a man saving another from death. But now, looking back, he understood it had been the turning point of his entire existence. The ranch was no longer a place of loneliness. Apache children sometimes played among the corrals, their laughter ringing through the air. His neighbors, once wary, now regarded him with a new kind of respect. Some still muttered suspicions, but few dared speak ill of him openly. He had become something rare on the frontier, a man who had won peace where others only found conflict. As the river rushed on, Thomas realized that he had not only been rewarded with cattle, horses, and protection. He had been given something no money could buy, a second chance at life. A chance to rise above poverty, to find belonging, and to carve a future that reached beyond his own bloodline. Nahava appeared at his side, silent, watching the river with him. After a long moment, she spoke a single word in English, her voice steady. Together, Thomas looked at her, then back at the land stretching wide around them, and for the first time, he truly believed it. He had set out that day as a man barely surviving. He stood now as a man transformed, a man who had found fortune, respect, and an unshakable bond in the most unlikely of places. The river had tried to take one life, but in doing so, it had given another his.